that big a group here at the moment, and I can see a lot of people who are from a lot of different disciplines. And you know, one of the things that we need to think about is that, well, what is this all about? And so what I'm trying to do here tonight is to put it in a bit of perspective in terms of all the different things that we need to think about as we go through what do we do with the stuff that we discard. The first thing I'd like to point out is that I think that we should all recognize that recycling isn't something that started last year. It's been going on for eternity. People live, people die, and the material that you're made of is recycled back into something else. So that's gone on for as long as we can remember. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, the word recycling right now carries so many different meanings in people's minds, to the extent that the word really doesn't have a good meaning. And I know we're here to discuss a recycling topic, recycling rally. But really what we're here to talk about is how do we just survive. We're talking about survival. We're talking about how do we keep the earth whole and not letting it go to bits. And that's exactly what Mr. Babb was pointing out in his talk. So I support you 100%. So because of that, we need to kind of broaden what we do a bit more. I mean, in this room right now, we have, you know, reporters, and we have recyclers, and we have people from the construction business, and we have also all individuals. What we do, what we're doing with this material affects every one of us. That's one of the things that we found at SBRC, that we don't, there is no one that SBRC does not affect as you know, we go through every day. All the stuff that we throw away ends up back with us to be processed. So we touch everyone every day because of that. Okay, so yes. So the first thing I want to try and get over is that if we look at waste, and we look at waste quantities, we talk about plastic and we talk about all the components of waste. A lot of these components make up a very small bit of the total waste that we manage. So everything has to be put in perspective. Now, sometimes the small bits are more expensive to process than the big bits. So I'm not saying that we don't need to consider every bit, everything that we do, every leaf that falls on the ground. We probably have to think about how are we going to process that, because that's the world we live in now. We now have such a connection between our demands and the ability of nature to put those demands back into perspective, that we now are managing just about everything that we do. So it's very difficult to just ignore any piece of it, whether it be plastic or seaweed or oil or any of the components of waste, or the things that we now classify as waste. Because again, waste, the question is, what is waste? So there are 3 steps really that let's go through the quantities. The waste is collected and transported by the government. So the waste total is about 1,300 tons per day. 1,300 tons per day is what's generated in our areas. That's not a hard and fast number, but it's an approximate. All these numbers are approximate. The waste is collected by the government, so that is the one that's collected in the dustbins around everyone's houses. That is probably about 180 tons a day. Alongside the waste that the government collects is also waste that's collected by private collection services. So that is not all the waste that is collected from households, but it is what's collected by government. Then waste is collected by private contractors, is about 880 tons a day. But you have to remember that a lot of that private waste is coming from the construction business. So it may not be collected by government, but it's also not collected from households. And then There's waste that's delivered directly to recyclers, the group of companies that we call recyclers. But again, as Mr. Bob pointed out, none of us really are recycling. All we're doing is collecting, packaging it up, and sending it off to somebody who then converts it to some other material. So I'm not really sure where recycling begins and where it ends. So recycling has a lot of connotations that are very confusing. In any case, the recyclers get probably about 300 tons of material. A lot of that is metal, and so that is very dense and very heavy. So that 300 tons seems a lot on the board, but in terms of actual volume, it's not probably that much because it's made with metal. But it also has plastic and cardboard and glass and other stuff in there. And that comes to a total of about 1,300 tons a day. Now, when you go to manage that waste, what you do with it, well, the first thing you have to do down the bottom here is you have to collect it. So again, the government is collecting about 180 tons a day. Private is probably doing about 820, and I'm putting that at a total of 1,000 because I'm not counting in the waste that's going directly to recyclers. And in that group that goes directly to recyclers, I'm not talking just about private people, but also those bits of the waste management process that are handled by, for example, the port, or the two ports, the airport and the seaport, and the hospitals, the medical waste, and that kind of stuff. So that would be in this as well, which would actually be government. So under the private title, there's a bit of government in there as well, but through a different agency. So the first thing is to collect it. The next thing is to process it. So the government basically contracts SBRC to process it up to 1,000 tons, well not up to 1,000, minimum 1,000 tons is what we're contracted to process. And then there's the disposing of the waste. So again, you've got 1,300 tons coming in, you've got to get rid of 1,300. The government roughly is handling about 500 tons of that in the landfill. And there are, as I pointed out, some other areas like the hospital incinerator and the port incinerator and so forth that the government will do as well. But that amount, which I have under the heading of private, comes to another 800 or so tons. If we look at the cost of doing that, I put these costs in percentages because, again, these are estimated costs. We don't know. These are costs that some of which the government will have clear knowledge of, and some are more difficult to actually add up, but these are estimated. So if you're looking at the cost of collection, collection makes up about 41% of the cost of waste, and it only actually, this is to the government, it only actually involves about 20% of the waste that costs 41%. Collection in developing countries tends to be high because we don't have a high disposal cost, at least not as high as developed countries, which are disposing in more sophisticated ways. So they're putting it through waste energy plants and other processes that make their disposal costs higher. So as a percentage, what you have is collection tends to be higher in developing countries. Also, with collection, there are more efficient ways, I guess, or I don't know whether they're more cost effective, of collecting waste if you have mechanical collection. So the bins are collected with mechanical devices that load the trucks. So you don't have people employed to do that. Whether that actually has a minimizing of the collection costs, I don't know. And then there are other logistical issues that may reduce the collection cost a bit, but generally speaking, that's a high number for us to have to deal with here. Then there's the processing cost. Again, when the garbage is collected, when all the waste is collected, it has to be separated initially into some form of groups of materials that can then be disposed of in different ways. In a lot of parts of the world, if green waste, for example, is collected, it'll be disposed in a green waste facility. If construction waste is collected, it'll be disposed of in a construction waste facility. We don't have the luxury of having multiple facilities to dispose of our waste, so we do it all under one umbrella. And that is what's happening in the processing side. After it is processed, then it is disposed, and the disposal process includes recycling. Right? So recycling is a disposal process. Landfilling is a disposal process. Then you have, in the way that the cost structure is set up here, there are other disposal operations other than the landfilling, which are lumped under the solid waste management program. But we're probably at another 7% or so of the cost. And then there's an administrative overhead cost that will be holding another 7%. If you look at that total spending as a percentage of the island's GDP, it comes to about 0.79%. Now, if you compare that with the England spends about 1% of its GDP on environmental protection. So again, going back to Mr. Bob points out what we're doing is we're not recycling, we're protecting the environment. That's what we're doing. We're taking this garbage we throw all over the place and destroy the environment, and we're trying to protect it by collecting it back and then trying to do something with it. So I'm not clear whether we can compare this number, 0.79%, with the English 1% of GDP, but it's ballpark. Again, the reason for having that number there is we have to think, you know, how much do we really want to spend to keep our surroundings wholesome? That probably is not a bad number, but anyway. And then, of course, there's private spending. So that 30% is as a percentage of the government cost. And so it's interesting because you say to yourself, well, just a minute. So private is spending 30% of the money, but collecting 800 tons out of 1,000, 80% of the waste. Well, that may be true, but you are looking at weight. These are percentages by weight. And if most of the private collection is construction waste, that weighs about 6 times what household garbage weighs. So it appears as though the private sector is collecting a lot more for a lot less cost. But if you actually turn it into volume, you probably find that the cost kind of levels out. The other thing, of course, is that collection in the private sector is not from a dustbin, it is from a skip. So a lot of the waste is already placed in the container, and private collection just has to go and pick it up with a truck. So you eliminate a lot of the actual emptying of dustbins into a container. I just put this on here just to quickly kind of guide you through the composition of waste over a period of time. The blue at the bottom there is actually an SW, which is the household waste. And you can see that over, I don't know, 20 or 30 years, it hasn't changed. It's really become quite stable, and it only really changes as a function of population growth, which is not very great. What happened back in the beginning of 2000s was that there were some cultural changes here. We said we didn't want to burn garbage on the end of the garden. We didn't want to, that's probably the main one. And so a lot of green waste, which is actually the red bar, started to arrive at the landfill. And then the landfill started to catch a fire, and then they had to cover it. So the next best thing after that, say, okay, let's get some soil and some rubble in to cover it. So then all of a sudden you found that there's an increase in your construction and demolition waste and all of a sudden. construction and demolition probably went up because of economic activity. So all the way through to 2009, when SBRC started, the landfill received more and more and more of this material that was not MSW, but was using up landfill volume. One of the things that SBRC did right after that was to divert a lot of that material, but the thinking is, oh, you've diverted it and it's evaporated into space. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's still in Barbados. It's just that it's not in the landfill. Because you would have to have, you know, ships lined up out there loading stuff on to get it out of here. So where is it gone? It's gone to what land reclamation sites, which are basically disused quarries or quarries that are exhausted, and they're filling those quarries. That is a requirement, actually, of town and country planning, that those quarries be refilled. Some of the quarry operators can't get permits to expand their operation until they fill what they've already excavated. So there's a necessity to move that material where it needs to go. The problem is that if you send that material willy-nilly into the quarries, then you get everything going in there. That's the problem. Now you're going to have, you know, unless it goes through a processing center, you can't then say, oh, I'm going to take the paint can out, or I'm going to take the, you know, the paint bucket and the paint can, and I'm going to take out the PVC or the plastic, or leave it in, as the case may be. You have no choice. It just ends up going to the quarry, and that is probably not a good thing, because those quarries are located. If you look at where they're located, you'll find there's probably one next to every water well that Barbados Water Authority uses to pump water that we drink. Right now, it probably isn't causing a problem, but you know what kind of leachate problems it will be in the next 50 years, we don't know. So there is a case for managing that waste before it gets. We know we can't get rid of it because the cost of shipping it all off the island is just phenomenal. So it has to be managed within the island, but we have to manage it sensibly. And that is part of the plan. Now, back in the 80s, the Pan American Health Organization did a study, not just of Barbados, but all the islands. And their recommendation was exactly that. Put in place something that allows you to manage your waste. Don't just have it going to the landfill or to a quarry all the time. Yet figure out what you're doing with it and send the right items to the right place. Barbados made that choice and put SBRC in operation through a competitive bidding process that took a number of years to sort out. And so that's what Barbados is doing. None of the other islands do it. And I can tell you, if you go to any of the other islands and look at what goes in the landfill, you'll be staggered. You know, it's not good. And a lot of them are actually smoldering away and burning. You don't really have that situation in Barbados. It's pretty much under control and well managed. Anyway, so that's just an idea of what's happening. So the gap, the blue line at the top is what is sort of what the estimate of waste generation. The lower line is what is actually still going to the landfill, the bottom part. So the gap in between is what is being removed, what has been removed by managing that waste before it gets to the landfill. Landfill is still there, it's still necessary, it's part of that disposal process, and it's part of actually recycling. We're going to get to that because, again, we dam landfills, but that's not necessarily a good thing for a developing country. So if you look at, again, I'm going through the process here. It's got collection, processing, and disposing. A lot of us as individuals, obviously we're putting the waste out for collection. So a lot of what Future Center Trust, it keeps telling us over and over and over again, is put the waste in a way that when it's collected, and again Mr. Bob went through that, don't mix it up. If you're going to have oil, keep the oil separate so that it can be collected and processed. You've got a better chance with that. collection, processing, we just discussed a bit, and then you have disposing. Well, disposing, reusing is one way to dispose of something that's counted as waste. Recycling, we have anaerobic digestion, landfilling, aerobic digestion. We can burn it as waste energy, and there are a whole host of, maybe other divisions of that disposal methods. If you pick up one more, the areas that are currently practiced are those in yellow. So we are doing reuse, we're doing recycling, and we're doing basically landfilling. Landfilling plays a major role in the whole waste management in the island. I don't see us moving away from landfilling for many years to come, with or without other disposal methods. You always need to have some landfilling capability. I don't know, I can go on talking about details of how all these things work and what people can do, what the community can do to help at the collection end, at the processing end, at the disposing end. But that's pretty much the end of my presentation. I just want to point out we have a number of people here from SBRC, and if there are any questions, I may deflect those questions to some of those individuals. But thank you very much, and thank you for Senator Trumpson.